Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. He was a convicted felon and he ran for president. He was in prison at the time of the election and he was known as Prisoner 9653. At his sentencing, he would be sentenced to 10 years in jail. He told the judge this, quote, "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kingship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." Obviously, this is not Donald Trump, but Eugene Victor Debs, who ran for president as a socialist from an Atlanta prison in 1920, in which he received nearly 1 million votes, which was significant for its time, though not enough to sway the outcome. He was found guilty for violating the Espionage Act of 1917 for a speech against the Great War, today remembered as World War I. Today we are going to talk about presidential candidates who were convicted of a crime and what their candidacy says about their time. Our guest is a good friend of this program and longtime political journalist, John Nichols of The Nation magazine. John Nichols, a very good morning to you, sir.
Very good morning to you, Mitch.
There have been others who have also ran for president from the jail cell. I learned in preparing for our chat, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints, ran for president from a jail cell in 1844. Lyndon LaRouche ran for president from a prison cell in 1992. And of course, Leonard Peltier with the Peace and Freedom Party, at least in the state of California, was on the ballot for president in 2004.
If I can add one more,
yeah.
I think Eldridge Cleaver in 1968 was not jailed, but was on the, was in the eyes of the law. And I think there was some, I'd have to be careful about saying his precise status as regards the law. But I think he was being hunted at the time by law enforcement forces and was, I think, also a peace and freedom candidate. And so we've had many people over the years who have either been in trouble with the law, been, fleeing the law, been incarcerated, who have sought public office. And I think to the credit of the United States, we actually allow it.
Have we ever had one that might have been running for president to stay out of jail?
Oh, that's a very good question. There's little doubt that when you get into the congressional level and the state legislative level, that there are folks who are looking for immunity, right? And if you move outside the borders of the United States, I might note Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who has had a whole bunch of legal problems there, and it's often charged in Israel that one of the reasons he wants to remain as prime minister is to avoid all the accountability that would come if he didn't have that position. So in the U.S. and around the world, there have been instances of this, but there has never been an instance, I think, where somebody was a clearly viable candidate, somebody who you would say, well, this person could become president of the United States, who was seeking potentially to get the office to stay out of jail, right, or to pardon him or herself. I don't think we've quite gotten to that point until now.
Just in all fairness, I don't send John questions ahead of time. I just ask him right on the spot, and whether he's prepared for it or not, which he normally seems to be able to handle quite adequately. But I did wonder, and perhaps he never got to the point of actually being a candidate for president. But could Huey Long have been in this situation? In Louisiana?
We had a lot of legal troubles down in Louisiana. No question of that. And I don't think quite. I think that because he was still serving in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think he was within the, he's kind of a Bob Menendez sort of situation at that point. But you're right that perhaps had he not been assassinated, and it's important to, that was part of the long and tragic story of Huey Long, had he not been assassinated and some of the legal battles proceeded, it is within the realm that he might have come into that clash. And remember, if Long was relatively young, yeah. There was talk of him running in 1936. Had he not been assassinated, there's within the realm of possibility that, well, if he didn't run in 36, he might have been around for a later run. And it is, again, within the realm of possibility that he might have had legal troubles along that way. So we can imagine all these things. We could talk about, other figures who've been certainly in conflict with the law, not headed for jail per se, but George Wallace as governor of Louisiana or Alabama. My mistake. I'm thinking too many southern states here. But George Wallace, as governor of Alabama, was in open and kind of constant conflict with federal law enforcement on civil rights issues. And he ran in the 1964 Democratic presidential primaries against Lyndon Johnson and actually got a very good vote. He got a lot of votes around the country.
All right, let me rein myself in because we asked you to talk about Eugene.
we could go down this rabbit hole.
We really could, because we've asked you to talk about Eugene Victor Debs and Donald Trump. But I guess one thing of all the names that we have mentioned so far, and there are obvious differences that we're going to get into between Trump and Debs, but maybe one thing that sort of is similar amongst all the names we've gone through so far is they were running for president oftentimes in some kind of a chaotic time. And this is certainly true for Eugene Victor Debs as well as it is now for Donald Trump.
Yeah, the parallels are almost jaw-dropping when you think about it. If you look at the 1920 election, right? This was the election immediately after World War I. And so it was an election coming after an unpopular war. War that was popular with some folks, but very unpopular with others. A war that caused a lot of dissent and conflict. And obviously, we are not in a war in Israel and Palestine per se, but we have an international conflict that the United States is very much involved with that is very unpopular, right? So you have that sort of foreign policy conflict that is causing demonstrations in the streets and protests and lots of debate, as World War I did. And its aftermath. Then you also had a pandemic in 1918, 1919. That was a really, really serious pandemic, killed immense numbers of people. And we had a pandemic. There was an economic turbulence and downturn associated with the pandemic at a certain point. Then we came out of it pretty quickly. Similar pattern here. And amazingly enough, at that time, there were people running around who were really mad at immigrants. And trying to make immigrants into a big political issue, as we have today. So yeah, you can imagine it. And then one other thing that's kind of interesting was that the 1920 race did not have an incumbent president. Woodrow Wilson was standing down, but you had a kind of a sense that the two major candidates running that time, James Cox and Warren Harding, were kind of boring people that most Americans weren't very excited by, and I dare say, without casting too much judgment, that there are an awful lot of Americans who are rather dissatisfied with the current presidential choice between Trump and Biden. And so, yeah, you can find a lot of parallels.
What's important to know about Eugene Victor Debs? I mean, I think there's probably a lot to know.
Yeah. Eugene Victor Debs is an amazing figure in the American story. He was definitely born and raised not in poverty, but in real working class circumstances. Came up in Indiana and took a real working class route. He became involved with railroads and railroad unions. At that time, railroads were that was the way we moved in this country. And
it was the internet of the day.
What?
It was the internet of the day. I mean, just the parallels.
It was everything. Yeah, you're right. Railroad communications was huge. Yeah. That's totally right. And people were making their fortunes with railroads, right? It was before the kind of classic modern image of fossil fuels. The railroad was the vehicle by which, people moved. And if you owned the railroads or owned a railroad, you made a lot of money. There was an immense amount of exploitation of the workers on railroads. And so Debs, as a young man, bright young guy, became very, very involved with the Railroad Workers Union. And he was a fascinating figure because he was deeply rooted in his Christianity, deeply rooted in his understanding of a working class struggle. And he blended these things in a whole bunch of ways. He knew his history well, too. So he quickly became a leader of the Railroad Workers Union, one of the Railroad Workers Unions, and at a critical point took them out on strike. That strike was a huge national phenomenon at a time when the United States had its media, mostly newspapers and its political class were pretty much very anti-strike, like much more so even now than a lot of Nikki Haley's or people like that. And so it was a very controversial strike, and for a variety of reasons, Debs ended up in jail. And when he was in jail, as a popular figure within the working class, and this is a time of populism and lots of rising movements there, he was visited by a guy named Victor Berger, who was a European immigrant who had come to the U.S. and was very steeped in socialism and Marxism. And at the jail in Woodstock, Illinois, Debs left him a pile of books by Marx and other people. Or, I mean, Berger left a pile of books for Debs by Marx and other folks. Debs sat in his jail cell, like many people educated in jail. He read all the books, and he got a much deeper understanding. He'd already been, I think, moving toward socialism, but he really committed at that point. And then it began to become essentially what was the most well-known and effective popularizer of socialism in the United States, along with a number of other folks. This was a time of great socialist ferment around 1900. And he became the kind of constant Socialist Party candidate for president, running as a Social Democrats in 1900, then Socialist 1904, 1908, 1912, again in 1920. And he became kind of a major popular figure, again, because of this ability to blend kind of a Christian fervency, like a very moral voice, with a radical critique of our economy. And people kind of, people who were his followers loved him. I mean, he had a very strong level of support. In 1912, he running as the Socialist Party candidate for president actually beat the Republican candidate in several states. I mean, there were four candidates that year: Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Debs, the major candidates, and Debs actually beat Taft, the sitting president, in a couple of states. So I mean, it's pretty. He was moving, things were happening, socialists were getting elected to Congress, mayor, stuff like that. Long story short, World War I comes, and this is the great wedge kind of in American progress at that point, as wars often are. We think of the Vietnam War similarly. The progressive movement had been very much on the rise, making a lot of social reforms. Labor movement had been on the rise. World War I comes, and Debs and many socialists and many people on the left, and also many anarchist people like Emma Goldman, oppose the war. There's a huge crackdown on opposition to the war, even though there is a lot of opposition out there. This crackdown is very intense. The Wilson administration, the Democratic administration, is incredibly visceral in its crackdown, and they're kind of hunting for people to jail. Right, that's the bottom line. They're just looking for ways to get you. Amazingly enough, A. Philip Randolph, who would go on to lead the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and eventually call the March on Washington in 1963, was a young socialist editor at that time. He was tried for things that he said and wrote. So everybody was getting, pulled in and tried. Debs goes to Canton, Ohio, gives a speech that is a clear anti-war speech. Is a good evidence that he was misquoted by FBI folks or not FBI at that time, but like by investigators at that time. But they charged him with essentially telling people to refuse the draft, right? To not go serve, in this war, or not support this war in the broader sense. And he was tried. It was a big deal trial, a lot of attention to it. Debs never denied his opposition to the war. And frankly, he didn't fight the actual charge that hard. Basically, what he said was, I've got a right to oppose the war. I've got a right to speak out against this. If I don't, then you ought to put me in jail, right? Because I'm not going to renounce where I stand on these things. They did put him in jail. They sent him to the Atlanta Penitentiary. And that brings us up to this story today, because he was an absolutely beloved figure within the jail. He taught other prisoners. He was kind. He was apparently, when he left jail, there was like everybody in the jail was sort of cheering him as he left. It was such an absurdity to have him jailed, but also he did it so honorably that in 1920 there was no question the socialists were going to nominate him for president. And they actually, they had a good run with it. They made pins that showed him in his prison uniform and had his prison number, as you mentioned, and they made a big deal of the fact that he was behind bars for opposing what they saw as an illegal and immoral war, and opposing what they saw as an illegal, or at least an immoral, class system. And he did get better part of 1 million votes, ran very, very well in a number of states. New York, there are many parts of New York City where he came in first or second. Uh, Parts of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, which was a very socialist town where he did very well, and other places around the country. And then the last part, I'll tell the story, and then we should go into the deeper conversation here. Um, Debs was ailing at that point. He did get out of jail. Remarkably, he was released from jail by the Republican who beat him, Warren Harding. And Harding was
Wilson
only
would never. Wilson would never.
Wilson was horrible. Wilson was. I mean,
Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson was awful on these issues, and so, frankly, so were a lot of Democrats, to be honest. And Harding, nobody expected Harding to be all that great either. But the funny thing about Harding was he was really trying to. Harding was big. He had almost a philosophical obsession with an idea of normalcy, right? He wanted to return things to what he thought was normal. And one of the things that he thought was normal was that you didn't have one of your opponents sitting in jail, basically. Also, he didn't see any good of continuing it. So Harding let Debs out of jail. Gave him the free pass out of jail.
Did he commute him? Do you know? Was it a commute or?
I don't think it was.
I don't think it was a pardon. Was it?
It wasn't a pardon. It was. I think it was a commutation of the remainder of the sentence. That there are people who are experts much more than I on this, so they could look at the exact details. But he was let out. It was right around Christmas Day. And the only ask that Harding had was that on his way back to his home in Terre Haute, Indiana, that Debs would come up the East Coast to Washington and have sandwiches and tea with him at the White House, which Debs did. And it spoke to an interesting dynamic of the times, but the bottom line reality of it is that Debs got out of jail, and he then did not run for president in 1924, but he endorsed Robert M. La Follette, the most successful left-wing candidate for the presidency in the modern age. La Follette got almost 5 million votes with the support of the Socialist Party. And basically, in those campaigns of 1920 and 1924, the socialists and then the La Follette progressives really laid the groundwork for what would become the New Deal. When the Depression hit, you'd already had a politics that had been kind of laid out in this country that talked about Social Security, that talked about farm programs and protecting workers and strengthening unions and taking on monopolies. And so Debs becomes, for a variety of reasons, a very significant historical figure, not merely as a guy who was in jail and ran for president, but frankly as a guy who scoped out, at least in many senses, a vision for a lot of what would come to pass or come to occur in the governance of the United States in the decades that followed.
He wanted a revolution through the ballot box, which was actually a common thought among radicals, including communists in the first half of the 20th century in the United States.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and it was around the world, right? And it wasn't such a crazy thought, by the way. Remember that the first part of the 20th century was a time of revolutions. There were a lot of things going on all over the world, including the Russian Revolution, but all sorts of revolutions in countries in Europe, and frankly, in places all over the world. In parts of Africa, and parts of the Middle East, and parts of Asia. They weren't always successful, but there were people really trying to throw off colonialism, to alter the politics of the time. Why? There's a whole bunch of reasons. One, colonialism was awful, and the economic systems of the time were pretty bad as well. But there was something else, that we had communications exploding, right? You had, the mass circulation of printed matter. You had easier transportation. You had kind of an evolution of, how we organized politically in all sorts of ways. It just became easier, frankly, in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of international communication, people coming from one place to another and bringing ideas. And so in the United Kingdom, as an example, Britain, there's formation of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party around, in this period kind of superseded the old centrist and right-wing parties and became, briefly a very powerful force. And then it would again rise. It may, a couple of weeks again come to power there, not as a revolutionary party today, but in those days, quite radical in many of its followers. And so this was going on all over, and it was happening in the United States. And Debs, I cannot begin to emphasize to you, as somebody who's written a lot about Debs over the years, Debs philosophically, like La Follette and a lot of these other people, they were really very patriotic. Now, Debs might refer to himself, as Tom Paine did, as a man without a country, right? Or a man who, a citizen of the world. And Debs clearly said that, there's no question. And yet they were deeply rooted in American history, deeply rooted in the American experience, and frankly, in this faith in a possibility that the United States could actually be this very um, humane and decent and honorable force, for its own people and in the world. And that's what made them anti-war. That's what also made them economic justice activists. It's also what made both Debs and La Follette, uh, uh, even separating from a number of people on the left in those days, really good on issues of race and gender, supporting, an opening up of democracy. There was this faith, and Debs had an amazing habit, if you will, of claiming history for socialism. And his great line was, "Lincoln was a Red." And he made the case that Abraham Lincoln, well, maybe not a socialist, was somebody who was informed by left-wing writing and left-wing ideas, and in fact did land reform, and did take on the institution of slavery and things of this nature. Not as Lincoln could have done a lot more, but Debs, he had this talent for basically saying, yeah, what you like about America, that's the left, and you ought to empower it in the present time.
This reminds me of a recent conversation I had with Benjamin Balthasar, which was about the history of Jewish involvement in the Communist Party in the first half of the 20th century, including a long history of anti-Zionist work within the Jewish community, coming from the Communist Party in the first half of the 20th century. And his grandfather and he was saying the story on air, his grandfather was a communist who got in a lot of trouble, got fired from his job because of his affiliation with the Communist Party, but still made sure he flew the American flag on his home.
Look, I think that this is something that some of our Republican friends in the current moment who try so hard to make the S word such a scary thing, have a hard time wrapping their head around. I think they genuinely have a hard time wrapping their head around it. I don't necessarily even think it's cynical. But if you know the history, if you recognize the history, what you will recognize is that the socialist movements of the early 20th century in the United States were, I mean, they had picnics and bands, and you know what I mean? This was community, and they came to power in many places around this country. Debs' associates, people like Dan Hoan in Milwaukee, mayor of Milwaukee for 16, let me make sure I get this right. 24 years. Mayor of Milwaukee for 24 years. And by the way, the city where Republicans are going to hold their national convention and decry socialism. But Dan Hoan, mayor of Milwaukee for the better part of a quarter century, he was universally recognized as one of the best, most efficient managers, and in fact, got national awards and honors for his fiscal responsibility as a socialist, right? And he, interestingly enough, one of the reasons Hoan was so successful, and Debs kind of bought into some of these theories as well, was Hoan didn't believe in borrowing money. He thought you had to tax, get the money, and then use that to spend it. Why? Because he didn't want to be, in the service of big banks. And so as a result, Milwaukee ended up with, better balanced budgets and more efficiency than most major cities, even during the Depression. And they also did immense amounts of public health, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So when we begin to understand figures like Debs, and when we begin to understand those who are around him, the radicals of his time and in its immediate aftermath, what we do see is people who believed in many of those city on the hill concepts, that idea of perfecting the American experiment. But their belief in the perfection of it was that you had to couple it with economic justice. And if you listen to people like A. Philip Randolph and others, racial justice. And so they were ahead of the curve, I would argue, in many senses.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with John Nichols of The Nation magazine about presidential candidates who ran after being convicted, or who even ran from jail, as Eugene Victor Debs did in 1920, in which he received over 900,000 votes for president, which was significant for its day. Again, didn't cost anyone the election, but it was significant, especially running from a jail cell. It's interesting, John, you mentioned earlier, Eugene Debs is a labor organizer. Mm-hmm. And then he goes to jail for that. And it's in jail where he becomes radicalized by the books that Victor Berger brings him. Victor Berger is a name you and I have talked about on this show before. You've written a great amount about him. And so I guess it's after that he becomes this perennial presidential candidate. You know, in some ways, I've thought this before, Eugene Victor Debs reminds me of today, kind of Ralph Nader. I mean, Ralph Nader was a consumer advocate, right? But maybe the greatest consumer advocate we've ever known in this country, who later would become, as Eugene Victor Debs did, became a perennial presidential candidate.
Yeah, somewhat perennial. I mean, at a certain point, Nader stopped with fewer runs than Debs. Debs did 5 runs, and frankly, if he had had better health and lived longer, he might have done a few more. He believed in building the party by running for office. He didn't mind losing because he felt there was still some good that came of traveling across the country and campaigning. In fact, his great campaign in 1908, they actually rented a train and they called it the Red Special, and it went across the United States. They had a band on board. And they traveled town by town across the United States. They stopped at historical sites and did all this. And so he enjoyed this politics. He enjoyed, going out and talking to people and building this movement. And I think that makes him, maybe, I'm not sure how Nader felt about, actually being a presidential candidate. I think sometimes he relished it. I think sometimes he wasn't so as comfortable with the actual dynamic. But I would give you another example of somebody who only ran twice, but probably if he was younger might run again, and that's Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders, great, huge fan of Eugene Victor Debs. In fact, once did a short documentary on Debs when he was a young man. And still, when you talk to Bernie Sanders about Eugene Debs, he lights up. This is somebody who, for him, is a real reference point. And I mean, when Sanders ran for president in 2015 and 2016, at least initially, he was pretty much written off. There wasn't a sense that he was going to do that well, right? It was raising a host of issues. Now, Sanders became a very successful candidate and didn't win, but did very, very well. But it was still this core concept of an issue-driven politics. You entered electoral politics with the purpose of ideally winning, right? But if you didn't win, at least putting a whole bunch of issues into play, which other people would eventually steal, right? And so if we look at Sanders's influence on the Democratic Party, where you see many of the issues that he talked about in 2016 and 2020 now being incorporated into a lot of what the Democratic Party talks about. In my opinion, not enough, but a lot of it. That's an example of this. And again, with Debs, I think there's absolutely no question that what he and the socialists did in the 1910s, 19-teens, to some extent in the 1920s, had a huge influence on the reformed Democratic Party of the 1930s when Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, and others came to leadership in that party and said, we have to do fundamental stuff. We're going to have to do Social Security, right? And pause and think about the term Social Security. What is that rooted in, right? And talk about doing, big programs to strengthen labor unions. Where was that rooted in? That was similarly rooted in a lot of the politics of Debs and others. Talk about taking on big corporations, monopolies, having government actually deliver at least some services. And so they had, Debs had a profound influence, I think, on not just the politics, but the governance of the country. And I do think there are other figures in more recent years who have done the same. In fact, dare I say, and many of my Republican friends won't like this comparison. I would suggest Ronald Reagan on the right. When Ronald Reagan started out as an actor moving into politics, his passion was the ideas, right? He wanted to move the Republican Party to the right. Now, Reagan proved to be quite successful as a governor of California. But remember, Reagan and his circle kind of made a play for the Republican nomination as early as 1968. They got pushed aside by Nixon. They tried again in 76, got beaten by Gerald Ford, came back in 80 and won, and the rest is history. But I think we have people on the right and the left in America who are willing to mount presidential campaigns, not wholly for personal aggrandizement, right? Not for, I want to have power, I want the pomp and circumstance, but they really have a set of ideas that they want to advance. And I know we'll go through all this conversation here, but I think this brings us sort of full circle as regards our current moment, because when people compare Debs and Trump, I think that's the huge difference. I mean, Trump seems to be so absorbed with himself and so absorbed with his own, aggrandizement. Whereas Debs, I think, was in a wholly different place. I mean, he was in jail for very different reasons, and he was also in jail and ran for the presidency from jail for very different
Are
purposes.
you seeing those comparisons being made between Trump
Oh
and,
yeah,
and Debs?
you know, but not in a sophisticated way because our media in the United States doesn't cover politics, right? If it did cover politics, right, they would be doing exactly what we're doing, right? You dig into this and you kind of get a perspective. You recognize that there's nuance and complexity, and you can make historical references. That's fine, but make sure that they're understood in the context of their times and again with some perspective. That's not what's happening. What's happening now is that everybody's saying, oh, Trump might go to jail. I don't happen to think he will go to jail because I think we live in a country where it's very hard to put billionaires in jail or even faux billionaires in jail. But there's people saying, well, he might go to jail. And oh, that's just like Eugene Victor Debs. No, it's not. These are very, very different stories and very different trajectories. The only touchstone on it, or reference point, which you started with, Mitch, is this understanding that if someone is in jail, they can run for president of the United States. We allow that, and that's a good thing, right? Can't jail your opponent and then put that person off the ballot, right? There's some value in that, and I think, and just as I think there's value in letting people who are in jail vote, right? You ought to be able to vote. And some states in this country, we've made that very, very hard, or people even who've been in jail and done their time, we make it hard for them to vote. Um, it, there, we have a criminal justice system in this country. It does its work, for better or worse. We also have a political system in this country, and because you've gotten on the wrong side of the criminal justice system, shouldn't mean that you are, completely X'd out of the political process of this country for a whole bunch of reasons.
But unlike Eugene Victor Debs, we're looking at a situation where the other guy, Donald Trump, potentially, and we'll have to see what happens. There's still time till we get to November. On one hand, it's hard to believe he could actually win the presidency after all of this, but truthfully, he surprised me for the last 8 years. 8 years. So, I guess one big difference here is Trump potentially could win the
Oh yeah, I
presidency.
mean, look, Trump is look, he's a disruptor. I know that's a terrible like Silicon Valley term or something like that, but the fact is that Donald Trump came onto the political scene in 2015 uh, as somebody who'd been wanting to run for president for a long time. Remember, Trump hinted at running as a Reform Party candidate before and stuff like this. So he wanted to run for president for a long time. And in 2015, he decided he's going to make his play, right? He had set himself up by doing all sorts of, you know, horrible stuff as regards Obama, right? The birther stuff and all that. And he'd gotten himself a little bit of traction on the right and maybe even within the Republican Party. So he runs for president. And the thing to understand about Donald Trump is his first run, he ran against the Republican Party. He absolutely got on stage with everybody else as a prominent figure in the Republican Party. He said, all these people are horrible. They let you down. Don't trust him. And the things he said about, I don't, Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio is now the stuff of history, right? It was shredding them, shredding his opponents. And he basically shredded the leadership of the party and made the party a reflection of him, very close to a cult of personality. Took time, but that's it where it's ended up. And then in 16, he went after Hillary Clinton, brutally in many ways, lock her up, the crowds chanted. And he achieved the presidency, not winning the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College. And I guess that's the thing to understand about Donald Trump. If you apply to him the same rules that you do a traditional politician, you will always be wrong, right? You'll always misread it because what Donald Trump does, I think, as a political figure is look at the rules, look at the structure, and say, okay, that's a barrier to me. I'm going to try and see if I can upend that. I can kind of change how things are done. And so the question of whether Trump could run for the presidency from jail, we know that legally he can, right? But then you go to the deeper question, which you have raised, Mitch, which is, could he possibly win? I think it's unlikely, as I've thought all along, but it's certainly not unreasonable. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. So that is very different from
So even
Debs.
though the polls are putting Trump slightly ahead right now,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you think you think it's still unlikely he wins the presidency?
I do, but that's, I mean, put that in a put that wherever you want to put it, right? That's punditry. That's
Yeah.
probably the worst of all of
I mean, we thought it
all.
was unlikely in 2016, so at least I
Yeah,
did.
although I give myself minimal amount of credit because I wrote a piece for the Nation saying this guy actually could. You got to be careful with it. He's got some arguments that might get him further than you think. So I've always thought he could. I've always thought he had some political skills that allowed him to get further than you might expect. But here's the really big difference, Mitch, between Debs and Trump. Big difference. Um, Debs was the leader of the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party was a small party. It had um, mayoralties. It had a couple members of Congress, including Victor Berger and Meyer London, people, and it had some political traction in the country. Some places like Milwaukee, it was very strong. But it wasn't a powerful national party. This country has, unfortunately, in my view, since the 1850s, been a pure two-party system, right? You have other parties that rise, and try to break that, and more power to them, because I think a multi-party system is preferable in a lot of ways. But the reality is these two parties have so dominated not just the structures of the country, but also the media, kind of the whole discourse about politics. So when you are the head of a small party, as Debs was, you're one thing, right? Whether you're in jail or not, there's a certain sort of a ceiling on you. Um, if you're the leader of one of the two major parties, right? You come into the political process, no matter how much trouble you're in, no matter how good or bad you are, with something in the range historically of around 40%. Now, because we've become, I think, an even more deeply divided country, I think you're talking 45, 47%, you know, just by having that letter after your name, R or D. And that means that if you are the candidate of one of these two major parties, no matter what trouble you're in, no matter what's going on, you're probably going to win at least 20, 22 states. You're going to win a whole bunch of electoral votes. And when you understand it in that context, the prospect that you might become president of the United States is pretty real, you know?
And the support he receives from the Republican Party still today is striking. I was struck by listening to Marco Rubio talk about the conviction on 34 counts, or yesterday on Meet the Press, Senator Tom Cotton.
Yeah.
I mean, this is with the jury. This isn't an impeachment trial. In which the other party is trying to impeach you, and you have your own party members trying to disrupt it and keeping it from happening. This is a jury trial. This is you found a number of jurors that each side would agree to. You had a trial. It went all through, and they unanimously found you guilty on 34 counts, and yet they still want to. They're still using basically the same talking points, with differences, obviously, that they were using for the impeachment trial. That it was just all rigged.
Well, yeah, exactly.
And it's not just Trump saying this. It is basically the leaders of the Republican Party.
Well, in fact, both the people you mentioned would both like to be Trump's vice presidential nominee,
Yeah.
Rubio and Cotton. And so they're not only like defending, in some philosophical sense, they'd actually like to join the team, right, and be a part of the ticket. And so, yeah, you do see this writ large across the Republican Party. There are a few dissenters, Lisa Murkowski, Larry Hogan out in Maryland, who have been savagely attacked by the rest of Republicans for even saying, well, maybe you ought to at least think about the rule of law. And that's the nature of contemporary politics. It isn't just the Republican Party. I think both parties have become really, obsessed with the defense of their own. And the tragedy in this case is that I think that Trump's convictions by a jury that was chosen with the oversight of Trump's own lawyers as well as the prosecutor's lawyers, it's a conviction in a trial brought by an elected local prosecutor, right? There's a lot of things about this that historically in this country I think you would have had more respect across both parties, right? And there would have been, it would have been different in the past, and so. We have changed a lot as a country. And one of the things that's healthy for us as a country is to pause when we've changed a lot and ask ourselves some fundamental questions. Is this where we want to be, right? Do we want to, kind of be in this kind of cycle of retribution and where impeachment is pretty much off the table because whoever's in office, the other side's going to try and impeach, no matter how right or wrong or whatever. Where criminal trials, even when they have mounds of evidence, are dismissed as being rigged or unfair. And it is a politics, a contemporary politics that is a really tough politics. It's one that I think causes a lot of Americans to be overwhelmed and frankly disgusted. And again, that brings us back to that Debs run in 1920. In 1920, right, in a very turbulent time, when Debs ran for the presidency, people weren't thinking, I don't think most people, maybe some very passionate adherents, weren't thinking that he was going to become president of the United States. But in an odd sense, Debs's campaign for the presidency in 1920 was a hopeful candidacy, right? This was a guy who was jailed not for business crimes or for trying to overturn an election or something like that. He was jailed because he had expressed an opinion, a point of view. He had said he was opposed to a war, a horrific war.
Do you think his runs, his numerous runs for presidency, including for the one in 1920, or likely for? I mean, I guess he was jailed in 1918. But right. Do you think his runs for president were part of the motivation to go after him?
Sure. Oh no, he's a prominent figure. I don't think there's much doubt of that. But what I will emphasize is it wasn't just him, right? That the Palmer raids and the first Red Scare of 1919, 1918, 1919, 1920, run by a Democratic president against the left and against anarchists, socialists, nascent communists, a lot of immigrants, a lot of people of color. I mean, it was much broader than just Debs. It wasn't that they just went after Debs. Debs got arrested and convicted because he was part of something much bigger, which was a movement that critiqued a war and that critiqued an economy. And those who had waged the war and those who controlled the economy absolutely didn't want that critique in the debate. I do think that's different than what we're talking about today. Many of the Trump folks will tell you it's the same, right? That Trump is being prosecuted because of ideas he's put forward or because of what he's done or because of who he is. And in our discourse, you have a right to make, whatever claim you want. But I think the comparisons between Debs and Trump are absurd.
It is an interesting question, though. Would we have all these prosecutions against Donald Trump if he just left quietly after the last election?
Well, Trump was always in trouble with the law. When he was a businessman, he was always having legal fights and lawsuits and bankruptcies and things like this. But I don't know. I mean,
but the guy, the New York district attorney, campaigned ongoing after Donald Trump.
Yep. And I think that certainly that gave a lot of ammunition to critics of the New York district attorney, right? I mean, it's obviously Jim Jordan and others have criticized him for that. And again, that is a part of our discourse. It's understandable. But one of the things is, it's where the conversation, and Mitch, I know we're almost done with the hours, right? So then we open up a much more complex thing of prosecution of those who do wrong is a very complex thing in this country because it happens a lot, whether you did right or wrong. If you're poor, if you're working class, if you are, a dissident, right? That happens a lot. Prosecution of the wealthy and the powerful and the connected, much less common. And so what you've got with Debs is an example of a prosecution of a working class dissenter. With Trump, you have a prosecution of a former president who's very, very wealthy. And we still have the rule of law. You got to be fair to all sides, poor and rich, connected, disconnected. But at some fundamental sense, we do have to understand these are distinct, right? That Trump has had the benefit of tremendous amounts of resources to defend himself, and he will continue to have that. He has the benefits of being a wealthy and powerful individual in this country. Debs did not have that, and so Debs did go to jail, and he ran for the presidency from jail. I doubt very much that Donald Trump will end up running for the presidency from jail.
I think I don't know if it would have been different, but I do think it's fair to wonder at least that that we have a history of not going after a president after they leave
Yes.
office.
Yes.
That if Donald Trump just left after the 2020 election.
Oh, I think it might have been different.
You think
Yeah.
so?
Yeah. I mean, look, some of the things that people are critical of Trump for might well still be prosecuted. It's within the realm. But one thing that I would tell you would be unquestionably different would be the media attention to it, right? There are many people who criticize the media for over covering Trump. I'm cautious about that because the fact of the matter is this is a guy running for president of the United States who's in a lot of trouble, right? Or has got these scandals, controversies surrounding him. I don't think you can overcover that. That is a real story, right? And that's a part of our discourse, of our understanding, of where we are, or maybe where we may want to be as a country. So I don't necessarily agree with how our media covers Trump or covers politics. I think our media has a very vapid approach to covering politics, and I've written many books about it, and I'm kind of quite a critic of it. But the fact of the matter is that we're having this discussion now, you and I, because Trump is running for the presidency, and now we're looking for this comparison for 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, with somebody else who ran for the presidency in legal troubles. And I think that's great, right? It's good to, kind of dig into our history and dig into this. But I do think it's important to understand that there are a lot of differences and a lot of distinctions there, right? The one thing that is the constant is that when you are in politics and you're running for office, you ideally get covered, and it becomes a big subject. And then this is the thing about media and democracy, Mitch, that coverage ideally does allow people to make their own choices, right? At some fundamental level. If you thought 100 years ago that Eugene Victor Debs was treated unfairly and he was a good man fighting a good fight, you voted for him. Similarly today, if you think Trump is being treated unfairly, you may end up voting for him. But I do think it's beyond that core dynamic. There are real distinctions between these stories.
Finally, we're down to our final couple minutes, but I can't help but think about if Donald Trump and if the majority of the leadership of the Republican Party, which is one of two parties that govern this country, if they, and maybe insincerely, but I'm thinking if they sincerely believe that Democrats are weaponizing federal power and going after Donald Trump and Donald Trump supporters and Republicans, and that this is utter lawlessness that is happening, what does that mean then if they get to power? Well,
Donald Trump himself has suggested, I'm your retribution, I believe, and I hope I'm not misquoting him. And so he's been rather clear that if he becomes president of the United States, he definitely wants to change the federal government in fundamental ways. He is not the author of Project 2025, this vision for restructuring how the federal government operates, but he is certainly sympathetic to it and has allies who are engaged with it. And this is an idea of making the federal government much more a reflection of the president of the United States, right? And of the president's moods, of the president's anger, of the president's disdain for those he or she may think have treated them poorly. And so at some fundamental level, what we have to understand is that in our politics, the danger is a government that is in the service of one individual or one party or one politics. It's one of the reasons why we fought so hard more than a century ago for the civil service, right? To have elements of the government that were separate from the individual who was at the top in the top office. It's why we elect so many offices in this country, why we elect state attorneys general and district attorneys and counties around this country. One of the reasons we do that is that we do want to have separated power. We don't want to have power concentrated in the hands of an individual or of a few. And so, I think we are in a dangerous period right now, because you do have that notion of a push and pull and retribution. And I don't know if you can hear the rain in the background.
It certainly got darker on your screen.
Yeah, and there's a storm happening outside my window, so that to make it for what it's will. I do not happen to believe that is a metaphor for our moment. I just think it's Wisconsin in the summer. But what I will tell you is that these are very, very turbulent times. And the healthiest thing we can do in these times, Mitch, and maybe it's not you and I, because maybe we're very imperfect, but the healthiest thing we can do in these times is to have long, deep discussions about history, perspective, and what we want to be as a country. That's a big deal, and it's a healthy thing. And I think we need much, much more of it, because my sense in traveling across this country, and I've been all over the country a lot in recent months.
Down to our final
one place
10
I don't go is
seconds.
Washington very
Final
often.
10 seconds.
What?
Final 10 seconds.
I'll say that I've been around this country a lot, and I think there's an awful lot of people that are really unhappy and really frustrated. And if you're unhappy and frustrated with your politics, maybe it is time, in fact, to look at real big reforms.
John Nichols, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Pleasure to be with you, Mitch.
You could read John Nichols' writings at thenation.com. That does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kristen Thomas is the engineer. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.